Hello and welcome. My name's Neil Cooper, former shepherd. Worked on a very large flock of 1,300 ewes at Goodwood Estate and a couple of other large flocks, another one in Surrey of 1,300. Not working with sheep anymore. I'm shepherding people these days as a spiritual teacher. But this video is, again, pre-lambing things we need to do. And I spoke on my last video about, step feeding ewes up to lambing, and also about progressively stepping them up to higher quantities or flat rate feeding, which is just feeding them the same rate all throughout from start to finish, and both work quite well. So, but if you have marked your ewes for with your rams when they're out, and you know that they're in 2 weekly groups, then you can go through about this time, and you'll be, if you're lambing about the 10th of March, be starting to actually feed them some concentrates. If you're feeding hay, that will provide maintenance, which it would be just enough for the ewe to provide the herd needs. So you do need to feed concentrates. Obviously singles are not so important, but you've got to feed for a twin on average. You might have triplets in some, so it's going to vary a bit. But so the gestation of a ewe is 5 months, which is 147 days the gestation of most ewes. Some will vary one side or the other a bit, like we all do, but some breeds also will be a few days different either side. So quite often you'll find, if you've got a large flock, your singles will start coming first, and then your twins, and then your triplets. So, or sometimes the other way around. But it's good to be able to foster off during lamb time. Now, what you want to be doing this time of year, as I said in my last video last week, is obviously getting ready to do your vaccinations and drenching, because it's good to drench your ewes for worm burden before they go onto their feeding and before they come into the lambing yard or outside lambing, whatever you do. So you need to get your drugs and your drench sorted out, and then 4 weeks before lambing, give them their booster injection of a clostridial disease, maybe, if you do that, and also drench them. But 6 weeks prior to lambing, which is just before now, but you want to get your ewes in and maybe divide them up into their feeding groups, so you've got at least the first fortnight's worth of lambing in a separate group, and you start their feeding, and you either do the flat rate system or the step system of feeding of concentrates, about 16% protein, nuts, and progressively take them forward through that. Now, it's a good job to go through them twice a year to do condition scoring. Once is 6 weeks prior to mating, and the other time is 6 weeks prior to lambing, when you're going to begin your feeding. And the lamb does most of its growing in the last 6 weeks of gestation, that in the last week it's growing so rapidly that no matter how much you feed the ewe, she is still having to use a lot of her body fat. So in the last 2 weeks of lambing, you can get things like pregnancy toxemia with the odd sheep that, I'll tell you about that in another video later on anyway. But so condition scoring them. So you might want to give a bit more food to the very skinny ones. Now, condition scoring is scored from 1 to 5. And condition score 1 is a ewe or ram, whatever it is, that is very emaciated and near to death. And condition score 5 is the opposite end of the scale, a ewe that is very overly obese. So optimally, you want them 3 to 3.5 condition score. Now, the best way to do that is to get them into a pen and either grab hold of them, and obviously you don't want to be chasing pregnant ewes around too much if you can help it. So, get them in a tight pen where you haven't got to run around and catch them and cause them too much stress, or in a corral where they're in a single file, and just go along their backbone and hold their chin and feel their backbone. And, on a reasonable ewe, it should have a slight cover on a 3 to 3.5. Should have just a reasonable cover, not fat. You should be able to still feel the spine, but not too much of a dip either side of it. On a very emaciated ewe, obviously that's going to stand out like a razor blade, isn't it? It's going to be very notchy and they're the ones that maybe do need parting off because they've used already too much of their own body fat, and they're likely to have problems later on with pregnancy toxemia and such like, because the lambs are drawing so much food off them. They're also using what body fat they got, which they got very little of, and it can cause big problems, including abortion. So if you've got very emaciated ewes, less than 3, condition score 3, you want to part them off and feed them some more right at the beginning of feeding. So you go through that. I mean, emaciated ewe, as I say, very a prominent spine sticking up. Also, you can feel the loin just around the side of the spine, and the tail is another good place for seeing the weight they've got on them. You either have a very bony tail, or a tail with a little bit of flesh on it, or a very fat tail. And also the rib cage, you can run your fingers across the ribs on the side of the ewe, and they should have a slight cover on them if they're in the right condition. Or if they're very prominent, then they're underweight, of course. And, if you're putting your fingers across there and all you can feel is blubber, then they're very obese, of course. So optimally, you don't want to starve those obese ewes. You don't want to overly feed them, maybe, but don't starve them, because that lamb is growing inside them and it will still need feeding extra concentrate. For a twin, now, your normal ewes, then they're fine, but the emaciated ones you need to divide off into a small group, and just maybe, even if you can at 4 weeks, bring them indoors, because obviously they're using less bodily functions to heat themselves, so indoors may be better. And just feed them up a bit, give them some hay and a little bit of extra concentrate. So maybe an extra quarter of a pound if you're doing step, put it up a quarter. Keep it a quarter above what it should be, or extra, a little bit of extra feed if you're doing in kgs. Flat rate feeding, well, probably you want to feed them a bit more for the first few weeks, and see, hopefully they put a bit of condition on. So basically, you can get the book John Nicks, which will tell you, the value of how much that would convert that hay or feed into that ewe, how many kilojoules a ewe needs for twin lambs per day of feed, and what hay would provide of different qualities, what concentrates provide, and such like at different protein levels. So it's a handy book to have, the John Nicks book, so I recommend that. Just to keep an eye on that, and you can work out your feed values and everything with it. So now you might want to bring them in if you've got room indoors, or obviously if it's an outdoor lambing yard, then it makes no difference if they're in the field still. But if you have got indoor lambing yards, you might consider bringing them in 4 weeks before lambing. When you do your vaccinations, park the first 2 weeks off and bring them indoors, or you might already have them indoors. I mean, these videos, big flocks, well, if they already probably know what they're doing, this is for the small flock owner, or those that are just starting off on that road that want a bit of advice. So that's why I'm making these videos. Hopefully they'll be useful. So for now, that's all you need to do is begin your feeding about this time or shortly before this time, and just go through and condition score them and get them in the right condition. And in another week or 2, 4 weeks before they're due to lamb, then they want to have their vaccinations and drenching done. Obviously, it's not good to start handling, tipping them up and trimming their feet because they're pregnant, so don't do that. If you're going to trim their feet, do it in the individual pen just before they go out to pasture again. So I'll leave it at that for this video. I'll be making one quite regularly, working up to lambing, what we want to be doing, setting up the lambing yard, getting the pens ready, making sure you've got all the things you need, all the stocks and supplies you need for lambing time. So I'll talk to you next time. Thank you. Shep.